All right, let's talk about some examples of doubling in first inversion major and minor chords in a real example. Here's a short excerpt that uses a nice variety of first inversion triads. So what you should do is analyze the doubling for each one. We're in the key of F, and it starts with a 1 chord. 1 chord. Okay, so notice that for the 1 chord, it's actually goes from a 1 chord to a 1/6. First inversion 1 chord. And the 5/6 in the second measure is right here, because that's the third of the chord in the bass. So for each of those, the soprano was doubled with an inner voice. So again, look at the second chord. Here's the F chord, it's F-A-C. Here's the soprano, the F, and notice it's also in the tenor. Here's the second measure, it's a C chord. The second chord of the second measure is voiced like this. Notice that the soprano is G, and that the tenor is also a G. Now, you don't always have to double it in the tenor, but in both of these cases, the soprano is doubled with an inner voice. This is always the preferred doubling for first inversion major and minor triads. Now, let's take a look at another one. The 2 chord that's in the first measure, this is the third chord of the first measure, has the bass tone doubled with an inner voice. Now, as mentioned a little bit earlier, this is also acceptable, and it was necessary here to avoid a forbidden parallel. Because if we had doubled the soprano G with a G in the tenor on the 2/6 chord, there would have been parallel octaves between the tenor and the soprano. So when 2 first inversion chords appear in a row in a 4-part texture, it's often going to be really difficult to use the same doubling twice. In other words, soprano with an inner voice. And you may have to go to an alternative doubling. So let me show you that again. Here's from the beginning of this example. The 1 chord is going to a 1/6. Now, the next chord is a 2 chord. The 2 chord is G, B flat, and D. But it was voiced like this. B flat in the bass, so it's first inversion. But you notice that what we doubled was the bass with an inner voice, which is also allowable for these kind of doublings. If you had doubled the soprano in those 2 chords in a row, here we go again from the beginning. I'm going to do a bad doubling. The 1 chord, the 1 chord in first inversion, the 2 chord in first inversion. I don't know if you can see it, but these notes are parallel when I did that. Okay, so bottom line, if you have 2 first inversion chords in a row, you may have difficulty avoiding parallel octaves. So don't be afraid to use a different doubling rule. In other words, first double the soprano with an inner voice. That's always the best. But you can double the bass with an inner voice as well. So here, you get to try a few and check your understanding 9.2. Notice the first one shouldn't cause you any trouble because that's just 1 first inversion chord. Go ahead and double the soprano. But that second example might be a little troublesome because there are 2 first inversion chords in a row, and you might not be able to double the soprano on both of those. Next, let's talk about diminished triads. Now we know we have diminished triads. In a major key, it's on the 7 chord. In a minor key, it's also on the 7 chord, but also on the 2 chord. And the rules for doubling on the 7 chords, and even just using 7 chords, are rather particular. That's why we've been avoiding them to this point. But now it's time to go ahead and talk about it. Let's go ahead and play through this example. First chord, the spacing's rather wide, so I'm going to have to roll the chord. Okay, so take a look at the second chord. That's the 7 chord, and it's written in first inversion with a bass tone. The third is in the bass, and it's also doubled. So let's see what we've got here. We've got the key of F, And here, these are the chords in the key of F. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's the 7 chord. Notice I could have done this too. The 1 chord, I could have gone down to the 7 chord here. It's E, G, B flat. But look at the way it's voiced in that example. G, B flat, G, and E. First inversion, because the G is in the bottom. And notice the doubling. There are 2 Gs, G and G. So, let's talk about a few rules. When you have a diminished triad, always place the third of the diminished triad in the bass. In other words, you should always have diminished triads in first inversion. You really should not write them in root position. And double that pitch as well, double the bass pitch. Now, the reason why we do this has to do with the structure of this chord. This is a E diminished triad, and you might notice that there is a very prominent tritone. That's a diminished fifth between the root and the fifth, which is considered a very dissonant interval. Watch, I know it's a tritone because I can count the half steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 half steps create a tritone. So in this chord, you don't want to emphasize the notes of the tritone. You don't want to put either of these notes in the bass, and you don't want to double either of these notes. Instead, you want to take the most neutral pitch, which is the G, and make sure that's the one that's always in the bass, and make sure that one's always doubled. So easy. So the rule becomes this. Whenever you write a diminished triad, write it in first inversion, third in the bass, and make sure you double that pitch as well. So you can go ahead and try Check Your Understanding 9.3, and that asks you to write a few diminished chords. It already asks you to put them in first inversion. Just make sure you double the bass. Okay, one other topic here called the Phrygian half cadence. This cadence is only possible in a minor key, and it's only possible with inversions. Specifically, the Phrygian cadence is a 4 chord going to 5, but the 4 chord is in first inversion. It's actually a half cadence because it ends on a 5 chord. Here's an example. We're in the key of C, and we're going to write a 4 chord going to 5. But the way we're going to do it, we're going to put the 4 chord in first inversion, which means that the third of the chord is going to be in the bass. And then from there, we're going to move into the 5 chord. It's a really pretty sound. Let's get the way this has been voiced here. You might ask yourself the question, well, why is it called Phrygian? Phrygian is one of those ancient modes that was used during the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and the most salient feature of that mode was that there was a half step between the center of the mode and the second degree of the mode. And you can see from this Phrygian cadence, you kind of have that going on backwards. You have that half step into a cadence. So, when voicing these chords, just remember to double the soprano in the 4 chord. You know, the 4 chord is in first inversion, so go ahead and double the soprano, and then lead stepwise into the leading tone. In this case here, the leading tone was up in the soprano, and that will help you to avoid parallel fifths. Here's a nice little example from Robert Schumann's album for the young. It's called Folk Song, that involves one of these Phrygian cadences. So you can go ahead and do Check Your Understanding 9.4, in which you're going to actually harmonize some Phrygian half cadences. In each case, it's a 4-6 going to 5. So a 4 chord in first inversion going to 5. Just make sure when you write the 4-6 chord that you double the soprano with an inner note, with one of the inner voices, and then take care when you go into the 5 chord to make it nice, smooth voice leading.